the stage is yours to talk about women in tech.
Excellent, thank you.
Happy to have you here.
I know there's a large barrage going out. I won't be offended. I think, yeah, I am sorry, I don't have a quote to give you today, so I won't start as in an exciting way as he did. But I will start with 3 confessions. The first confession is I've been on holiday for the last 5 days, so this is my first immersion back into real life, and it was my first holiday in a year. So excuse me if I'm not as articulate as normal. My second confession is that I actually was adjusting things on my slides as much as 20 minutes ago, because I watched someone else talk earlier today, and she already gave some of the information that I would have shared. And the third confession is that I've only been working in tech for a year. I joined Uber on June 1st of 2015. So it's funny when I get asked to speak about women in tech and women's positions in tech. For the first few months that I was at Uber, I felt like a fraud. I'm not a woman in tech. I've just joined. Now I've been there for a year. It feels like I've been there for 10. So I have some things to share with you. So where did I come from? Aside from the fact that, yes, I'm American by that very American accent. This is the first American company I've ever worked for in my life. So when you're dealing with differences and understanding how the US culture looks at something versus how European or international culture looks at things, I have the same confusion because I've sort of dealt in the same environment. But I've spent my entire career in luxury. I worked for a company called Jimmy Choo, and I worked for them when it was a startup. I was their 4th employee in the US, and I was doing lease negotiations, finance, and HR. Then I went to a company you may have heard of called Louis Vuitton. And then I moved to what is the most masculine company I have ever worked for and will probably live to be the most masculine company that I will ever work for. And it was Moet Hennessy. So when people talk about sort of a masculine environment in technology and the gender balance in technology, I challenge them to go walk into the wines and spirits world and see what it's like there. I sat on the board of Moet Hennessy Europe, and of the 11 people on the board, which I refer to as male, pale, and stale, and I love them all, I was the only female. I was the only person under the age of probably 45, and I was the only American. So I sort of had 3 strikes against me. So it was part of my journey in terms of figuring out how to find your way in as a woman. So I won't spend a lot of time talking about that today, but if you have questions afterwards, I'm happy to discuss a little bit about that. But then I made the move over to Uber. I made the move over, actually. Uber reached out to me, and I thought, why not? I had lived in San Francisco for 4 years, and I had a little bit of this tech bug. My brother's 9 years in at Salesforce, and I'm like, tech is where the world is changing. And when you talk to people who are coming into the workforce now, and you speak to a lot of individuals, particularly when you speak to women, they really want to work in roles and work in organizations where they feel that they're making an impact in the world, where they're changing the world. Now, Uber, if you live in a really developed market, or maybe how you got here today, you think of it as like, oh, I press a button, I get a car. If you've been around for one of our stunts, you've pressed a button and gotten a puppy, or pressed a button and gotten an ice cream, pressed a button and gotten a Christmas tree. It was my favorite. They carried it up my stairs. But it's really not about that. And what inspires me about Uber and about working in EMEA is really about the difference that we're making to cities and the changes that we're making in people's lives. So it's this logistics platform that happens to move people at the current time. We move people from places that they may not have been able to get to. So we keep going where public transportation ends, which encourages economic opportunities for people who sit outside of that zone. Those are underserved people. Those are often minorities, lower income, and often women as well. But there's a lot more that we can do ahead, and that's really what drives me to be there, and that's where we're changing the world. But more about women. So my personal tech pioneer, my personal tech hero, that's my mom. That's in 1965, her giving some speech for God knows what. She sent it to me the other day. And my mother is the daughter of immigrants, German immigrants, who moved to the US when she was 12. And they lived in Pittsburgh. And she got into Carnegie Mellon, and she wanted to be a computer programmer. So there was no computer programming at that point in time. There was just math. So you could major in math. So she gets into CMU, amazing, and her parents won't let her go. So she had to go to an all-women's Catholic university called Mount Mercy, run by the Mount Mercy nuns, and live at home until the day she graduated college and married my dad a couple weeks later. And then she moved to New York. And she programmed on something like that. So she was a COBOL programmer for Prudential. And she was doing some programming where she was moving Fortran stuff into COBOL. And I've never even seen a punch card in my life in physical person. So, something very strange. And I look back and I say, I would say, and I had that moment where I was like, oh my God, my mom, other people were nurses or teachers or stay-at-home wives. And she was a computer programmer. That's awesome. That's amazing. And the funny thing is, I never realized that actually, I thought she was a pioneer. The percentages were low. We have more and more opportunities as we go along. And we're starting to have more and more women in sciences, in computers. And actually, we're wrong. So the data that I'm going to show you in terms of the years, the only reason why the measurement is from 1984 is, frankly, before that, there wasn't enough critical mass of computer science majors, so it's a little tough to track. So 1984, and this is statistics coming out of the US, 37% of the classes of CS were women. In 2016, it's 18%, or even a little bit less. And now you see all of the articles coming out talking about Silicon Valley and how it's so male-dominated. And I get these questions constantly. What's your gender balance at the office? What are you guys doing to adjust the gender balance? And when I look at the balance within Uber, as long as it's ex-engineers, if we take engineers out of the equation, we're quite balanced. Our A team, our senior leadership, holds a few women, and they're not only in traditional women's roles. One of the most senior people and one of the original employees, her name is Austin, so she's a she, even though it's Austin. And Austin is the person, basically any problem that nobody else can fix, it comes onto her team, she creates a team, she goes, she fixes the problem, and she changes things, and she does those next breakthroughs for us. When we start looking at engineering, though, of course, we're reflecting exactly what it looks like in a university class. We're a little bit better than that. But it's quite tough because I feel like Silicon Valley, we're getting a bad reputation for only having men or having more men than women. But to be frank, the top of the funnel doesn't exist for us. So in a Harvard business study, they're trying to look, why does this happen? What issue occurred? What created this problem? So they interviewed 2,500 young women. 90% of them were aware that computer science was an option, and only 44% were willing to try it. Why? There's a few reasons behind that. There's this thing called the confidence gap. So we discussed this around women being less confident than men in their abilities to do sciences, to do computers. There was someone on the stage earlier this afternoon who was based in Israel, and she was talking a lot about this, and she was talking about how if you go back and you look at a girl who's coding, you'll see how many times she's undone it and redone it, as opposed to just pushing forward. So it's this risk aversion. So many reasons around this. But 50% of the boys thought tech was a viable option when they were spoken to, and only 33% of the girls did. So it's a 30% gap right there, and that's at a young age. So we're already creating this problem when students are 12, 13, 14 years old. And then these are the images you see in the media. These are the T-shirts you can walk into H&M or Forever 21 or whatever store that may be. Allergic to algebra. I'm too pretty to do math. I remember my sister-in-law talking to my niece. My niece and my nephew were together. They're 14 months apart. We were watching music, and my sister-in-law asked my nephew Jackson, she said, "Jackson, what do you think?" And he gave a really intense answer. She asked Abby. Abby turned and said, "Huh?" And then her response was, "Don't worry, Abby, you're really pretty." And we giggled at that, and then I stopped and I realized at that point in time, Abby was 5. She's now 14, but she's had something like that in her mind. And these are the things that we do say to our women, and we do say to our young girls. These are images that we let them see. And these are things that influence their thoughts around this. Then there's also the misnomer of the bro culture that exists. When I walk down to the engineering floor, so I'm based in our Amsterdam office for Uber, and the second floor is where all our engineers are. I don't notice this. I grew up in a household with lots of kids. I have brothers. I don't have this sense of, oh my God, it's all guys. But I've walked down there with people before, and they're like, oh my gosh, there's so many guys. But there's a difference between having, a gender imbalance and the culture that perpetuates that. So what we can do is we really can't affect what's there right now, but it's about moving forward and how to create this inclusive environment. I pulled up this picture when I was looking. This is amazing. This is from Disrupt from a couple of years ago. And if you look at this picture, how many women do you see in this picture? I think I counted 4. So as you can understand, when you walk into some of these environments as a woman, you don't see representations of yourself there. It's a little bit difficult to aspire or to see someone that you could connect to. So it's about creating this inclusive environment, not only between women, but also between women and men. Men are also great at networking. There's this concept of the old boys club and how men help each other, men sponsor each other. Women, on the flip side, tend to hold other women back. So we're doing it to ourselves. There's often this perception of like, oh no, the men get it, the men promote other men. Actually, when women have the option to promote other women, when you look at statistics and you look at female leaders, they promote men even more than men do. So the imbalance there. They have this sense that they've had to work hard, they've had to go through this difficult time, so the other person should have to as well, instead of supporting and really pushing those women up. When I look back again at sort of my mom's generation, this was a generation who really pushed things forward for women and helped get women into new vocations, into new routes. And then a bit after that, I was born in 1977. There's my 4th confession of the day. My generation failed on this. We sort of thought we were there. And we really failed for the next people beneath us because we didn't continue to push forward and we didn't continue to help the women who were coming behind us. And now there's some catching up to do. And yet the curious thing is, as I look into this more and more, emerging markets are a bit different. The ambition gap is different. So when you talk about women and you ask them if they consider themselves ambitious, if you look at the BRIC nations, the level of ambition and the percentage of women that consider themselves ambitious, which is also linked to going into careers that are less common for women, it's significantly higher than it is in the US or in other existing markets. So if you look at this, 92% of Emirati women sampled considered themselves ambitious, and 36% of US women. In terms of interest in careers in CS and technology, in the US, 73% of high school girls are aware of these possibilities, yet only 33% of them are interested. When the same question is asked in Brazil, only 53% are aware, so the awareness level is not the same, but 82% of them are interested in these roles. That combined with this confidence, the difference in confidence, shows you the opportunities that we have in emerging markets. Now, Eastern Europe tends to really mirror a lot of this and a lot of what's coming out of the BRIC nations. And it leads me to think, is confidence culturally ingrained? And sort of, is this sort of gender design and this gender imbalance? What have these emerging markets done and what's different? And how can we make sure that we don't make the same mistakes as some of the existing markets? Now, the next thing I'm going to say, it's funny, when I brought it across my policy team, because they look through all of my slides before I speak, they were not thrilled that I was going to talk about this. But gender balance in emerging markets, there's definitely a link to post-communist markets. During communist times, there were differences in terms of balance, and women and men were able to go for more equal jobs. There was a bit less focus sort of on the family as there may have been in other markets, and it was a focus on the country and a focus on what we can do for the country, what we can do for the place. And in that, women and men had similar opportunities. If you look in Russia, they actually preferred to hire women in construction. They found they took less breaks. They could also pay them less, which is another problem that we'll get to sorting. But they were these people were in these organizations, in these companies, in these roles, in these jobs that you wouldn't find in other parts of the world. This first came to mind. I have a friend who's a filmmaker, and she's doing her thesis in Berlin. And she's studying actually the difference between women's roles in film and even how women were portrayed in film in East Berlin versus West Berlin. And what she's finding is, they were much more empowered in East Berlin during that time. And this trickles in through sort of the behavior and sort of the expectations of women. And this is where the difference is rooted from, and this is part of where Eastern Europe can really make a difference and continue to perpetuate sort of this confidence and this interest in these areas. So why is it a problem? Why does it matter whether we have women in tech or not? Women can do other things, fine. Also, please keep in mind that engineering is not the only job that exists in tech companies. Many of you have seen these stats talking about how companies with women CEOs, companies with women in leadership are more financially successful than ones with all male boards. Also, having a good representation of female members has a lot of key indicators that it pushes forward. It's also representative of our customers. So no matter what you're doing, no matter what your product is, you have a customer at the end of the day. Chances are your customers are going to be fairly balanced between genders. And as an organization, in order to make the best decisions and in order to create a product that best helps your customer, you have to actually reflect your customer. The other problem is, if you look ahead to 2020 in the US, so let's get excited and let's figure out how the US will open up more visas for everyone. Estimated 1.4 million new jobs in computer science in 2020. 400,000 graduates. So that's a deficit of 1 million people, 1 million talented people in 1 year that the US will have. And that's going to have a massive impact on the ability for these fast-growing companies to move. This scares the hell out of me. So last year at Uber, we hired, between January of last year and now, we hired 5,500 people worldwide. So those are our employees in our cities, our employees in our offices, our engineers. A third of them are engineers. They're not drivers. And it was hard. And it was with talent on the market. Yes, there's a fight over engineering talent in Silicon Valley. We've had to have a much more global approach in terms of how we find talent. But to think forward and to realize that we're going to have that much of a gap going forward, that impacts our ability to grow, to change, to evolve. So what can we do? There are a few actions we can take that can make a difference. This is a woman named Nelly Cruz. And if anyone in here is Dutch, I'm sorry I've butchered her name. I've had 1 year in the Netherlands and my Dutch is still crap. I sat on a panel with her recently. We were speaking at Salesforce World Tour. And Nelly is like super, super inspirational, very, very big part of the startup culture, and has really pushed to bring startups to Amsterdam. So in her pseudo-retirement, she runs something called Startup Delta and Startup Amsterdam. But when I was sitting with her, we were talking to a group of women, and someone asked her about being a role model. And she said the first time that someone said that to her, she's like, no, there's no way. I'm not a role model. Come on. She was the head of the Ministry of Transportation. She's been a big proponent of Uber. She's helped us out a ton. She's had an amazing career. But she still didn't recognize herself as one. But then she had the thought, and she's like, actually, I have to be one. I have no choice but to be one. So the women who are sitting in this room, and the men as well, you can be role models to women as well. But you have no option but to be role models to the people behind you. You must show them, you must encourage them, you must show them that these are viable options for them to have careers, that these are exciting careers that they can have, and to help push them forward. Create that old girls club, create that network. Old boys club, why can't we have our own? Why can't there be an old girls club where we do help each other, we do provide opportunities for one another? In this, though, in order to have people at the bottom of the funnel, so to adjust that sort of 18% number and push that back up, we have to make sure that we have people at the top of the funnel. So when we're hiring people, we talk about who we start with and who we end with. There's quite a great debate around whether or not to have quotas. I think you should have ambitions around having gender balance, whether or not you have quotas. But we push at Uber to make sure that that we were considering women candidates all the time. In my last company, we made sure that we had, in final rounds of top 3 candidates, there always had to be at least one woman in there. We've worked on unconscious bias. We've looked at, if we hand a CV to someone and it's a man's name on it, do they view it differently? If we have the same CV and has a woman's name on it, who gets chosen? And it's surprising how many times it's the man. At Uber, we haven't actually had that issue. We do see some things around universities at times. So it's sort of figuring out how do we eliminate those biases and how do we go out there and how do we encourage women and show women that there are possibilities at our organization or at your organizations. And then how do we keep them there? So since I can't talk about politics in my own country because it's so super embarrassing right now, I'll talk about a fairer nation, Canada. So Justin Trudeau, who's now the leader in Canada, when he was building out his cabinet, he made sure that he had a very balanced cabinet. He wanted to make sure that it reflected the actual population of Canada. So in terms of gender, in terms of sort of nationality, prior to being Canadian, in terms of religion, in terms of race, in terms of disability, to reflect the reality. So this is his new experiment. We'll see how this goes coming forward. But it would be incredible to see if you see the same impact that businesses have when they have a balanced as if you see a government. And it's not only getting the people there, but then it's making sure that they're included, that they have a voice, that you have a voice at the table. So when you talk about diversity and inclusion, diversity, that's the statistic. Okay, yeah, check, I have the box. Then it's what do you do with those people once they're there? How do you ensure that they have a voice? How do you ensure that they're heard? These are things that we test constantly in our organization. We have cultural surveys on a regular basis where we ask for feedback on this to make sure that that's happening. It's also ingrained in our cultural values. Things about the best idea wins. If you don't put forward, you own the idea. If you do not put it on the table, you are failing. Like, it is your obligation, if you have an idea, to put it out there and to make sure it's heard. We're also a culture of fierce feedback. Now, sometimes people think that, okay, well, it's a fierce culture, well, that must be masculine. No, as long as it's sort of equal opportunity fierceness, you put it out there, it's always constructive, it's quick, and we get used to it. It's ingrained in the people who are there. And that sort of encourages this inclusion, that encourages this debate, this conversation. And the other thing is to remove bias from pay, to remove bias from evaluations, and to remove bias from promotion. This is tougher. So in terms of removing bias from pay, one of the best ways to do this is to have sort of salary bands. So you have sort of, this is the amount that a software engineer 1 gets paid. This is the amount that a software engineer 2 gets paid. If it's not exact numbers, and if it's a band, you also may perpetuate like the problems that other companies have had. So you want to make sure that there's not too much of a variation. Some companies have done an amazing job at looking at this and have done some major, major changes. At Salesforce, Mark Benioff adjusted the compensation of all of the women in his organization to ensure that it was as high as men of equal positions. There's legislation that went through with the California government around this as well to make sure that there's equity in pay. But it needs to start early. Otherwise, we create it longer and longer. Also, in terms of evaluation and promotion, what are we making sure that that matters in a company? What are we rewarding? Are we rewarding things that are traditionally male behaviors? Are we only rewarding females when they're showing traditional male behaviors? There are different tools that you can use. I urge you to look at a tool. It's called Kanjoya, and I'm sure there are different tools that are similar. But we go through evaluations and we pull out in top 3, so our top performers, sort of the top 3 words that are spoken about those performers, and make sure that we evaluate people, and are those the relevant things that are being evaluated? So if we find that the things that are in those top 3 are actually very male traits, then we talk with the group, we remind the group, we embed again in the competencies, we embed again in our values what we should be rating people on and what things really matter. It's also worth it to try doing blind evaluations. So when you talk about your teams, to talk about the individual. Our organization is big enough that at some point we can take the names off and we can say, okay, this individual increased their business by X%. They developed 2 leaders, never saying a gender. And we tried this at one level this year during our calibrations, and it was amazing, the balance that we ended up with. So we A/B test everything, and then we B tested another. And the ranking of the men was over the women when the genders were known. The other thing is we have to educate our women, and we have to show them the path to employment. So there's great existing programs, Girls Who Code. Prince actually set one up where he also went out to lesser developed markets, then leverage current talent. So the women talent that are in your organization, get out there, get in front of young women, get in front of schools, show women that this is a viable path, and then make sure that they understand that there's a career that can happen after that. It's important to say, okay, this is it, and this is what it can look like. Learn this, you can do this. And also lobby for curriculum change. The mayor of Vilnius is a great friend of Uber who was in our offices a few weeks ago. Politicians are very open to talking to young people, to understanding what the changes are that are needed. We don't use our voices enough to talk about reform. It's enough to, we think that if it's enough to just purely vote, that's one way to do it. But as an educated individual and as a person with a voice, you have an obligation to go out there and to lobby for change and the change that's needed. And also make sure that when you're talking about your technology, when you're talking about your companies, when you're talking about your products, one of the biggest things that people say drive women is that they want to work in something that makes a difference. And then they want to work with a technology or with a company or with an organization that makes change and makes a difference and makes impact. So lead with that and talk to your teams about that. I want to end before a quick Q&A if we have time and share just a quick video.
Consider the bit, the building block of the digital world. It was invented just 70 years ago, yet in its short life, it has changed the way we communicate, do business, and live almost every aspect of our lives. For Uber, the bit represents our technology. It's complex, precise, and advanced. But when it's expressed, it is effortless and refined. And if you think the bit is a big deal, consider the atom. Born 13.8 billion years ago, the atom is responsible for everything, from the BLT to moms everywhere to New York City. And for us, the atom signifies our rapidly improving cities, the goods we move from place to place, and most importantly, the people we serve. Until a few short years ago, atoms and bits existed in entirely different worlds. But then, something happened. At Uber, we asked, what if we brought these two worlds together? What would that look like? It looks like this. We are able to create safe, low-cost transportation options like Uber Pool and UberX. We are able to create efficient and more reliable ways of getting people the things they need. We are able to deliver fresh-cooked meals from the most popular, iconic restaurants within minutes. And someday, safe, efficient movement of people and things at a giant scale. Most of us don't think about bits or atoms much, if ever. We think about how to get from here to there, the people in our lives, the millions of tiny dramas that play out across the world each day, the human stuff. Uber ultimately succeeds because we think about the human stuff first. But the way we do it, that's our secret. We leave no bit or atom unturned to create industries that serve people, and not the other way around.
So I leave you with that. If you have any questions, I apparently have 3 minutes and 5 seconds left on my ticking clock. So if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Yes. Yeah, I mean, in terms of engineering, there really are not a lack of opportunities. If you want to know about opportunities, please go to uber.com/jobs. I need 1,000 engineers this year. I think the US needs a bunch too. Those opportunities are there, they are existing. So, in terms of how we get women to go for those roles, to go for those jobs, there's the question, do we go for quotas? And we have a responsibility of our own as well to go in. I think, at times we're waiting for someone to invite us in. We also have to find our way in, and even when it's not traditional. When I was working in wines and spirits, first of all, I was working for a French organization. I didn't speak French. I learned how to speak French because then it got me a voice at the table. I learned that decisions were made standing out on the porch while someone was smoking a cigarette. So I had someone call me every time the person that I wanted to meet was going to go outside for a cigarette, and I walked out there with my cup of tea, and I had a conversation with him. So it's also putting yourself out there and putting yourself at that table. But there are women's networks, too, that are very helpful in terms of sponsoring each other and helping each other find solutions. I don't know if that answers your question a bit. We can jam on this even more later. I'm happy to jam over a quesadilla in a little bit. Does anyone else have anything they want to ask?
All right, I'm sorry to jump in, but we are running out of time. I'm sure if you have 5-10 minutes to answer some questions personally.